Welcome to Writer Syndrome, podcast about writing from start to finish. This episode, we're talking about dialogue tags and action beats. I'm Russ Capasso. Joining me as always is Tim Letney. Tim, how are you? Because I always ask that, so I figured I'd just continue to ask you, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I was going to add a dialogue tag to your intro, but I fumbled on it.
We're fumbling quite a bit.
Russ whispered as he stroked his beard.
So dialogue tags and action beats. This is the nitty gritty of the writing, right?
Yeah, I feel like this is the squishy part, that there is no, I think there are some hard and fast rules, but it really comes down to personal preference and personal style.
What's your experience with it?
For dialogue tags themselves,
let's start there.
If we go with tags, which by dialogue tags, we're referring to, character said, or said character, or, Russ whispered.
Yeah.
Tim chortled.
Shouted, exclaimed, asked.
So
that's a fan. Yeah.
I'm going back to what helped me kind of get moving again is that Stephen King on writing book.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he leaned into and I took to heart was don't use adverbs.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say, Russ said quietly. Or things like that. So I don't do that, which is tough because there are times, and I've just come across one where I really wanted to get across somebody saying something quietly.
Yeah.
Without saying said quietly. Or quietly said.
Yeah.
And I guess you could say whispered, but it didn't feel like a whisper.
Yeah.
Right. So it was somewhere in between a whisper and me wanting to use an adverb quietly.
Yeah.
And I was like, how do I get that across can I get that across with an action beat, with what the character's doing or how they're moving? Yeah. And I personally couldn't. So I didn't know what to do. I just ended with Judy said, so yeah.
My experience, my first draft. So there's a lot of little tidbits and tips I think I learned going through this process, right? First thing was don't need to use a dialogue tag for every single bit of dialogue.
Right. Yep.
Which I think I'm trying to think the first draft, I think I overdid it, but I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't realize it. I just I think in my brain, I was like, I need to do this so I know who's saying what. And then going through, second draft, third draft, I kind of picked up on, I was like, I think I'm using this too much. And then when you read books, you start paying attention to how they use it. And if you just have two characters talking to each other, it's okay to leave out the Russ said every single time, right?
So I don't know how you are as a reader, but for me as a reader, if you're reading something like McCarthy or other folks who use these dialogue tags sparingly, once you get to about 4 or 5 alternating bits of dialogue, I get lost personally.
Yeah, no, I do too.
I totally, and then I start skimming. I'm like, who the hell's talking? And you can't tell.
Yeah.
But that's me. I mean, maybe a more astute reader doesn't get lost.
I think it's a good general rule because I have the same problem. After 4 or 5 lines, I think you got to do a little refresher, or mix it up and throw in an action beat to kind of reset who's having the conversation. But yeah, no, I definitely run into that thing. The other thing you and I had a long discussion about was the formatting of it.
Oh my God. Yeah. You made me rewrite my whole book. I almost swore. I almost used a curse word. Yeah, I have every single, and I'm still catching them, by the way, because since there are a multitude of tags you can use, I went through and I switched the orientation of before I had said character.
Yeah.
So as opposed to character said.
Right.
And Russ thought that it sounded like Lord of the Ring. I think he said Celsior.
said Lord Loromir.
It was more like a high fantasy or something. For some reason, it felt natural to me to do that. And for the most part, I was consistent with said character. And then the more I read of comps, in my genre, the more I realized that I was not doing it wrong, but I wasn't doing it in line with other authors in my genre. So I went through and I switched it to character said, or character yelled, or character screamed.
Yeah.
But then there are some of the lesser used ones, like whispered or something.
Yeah.
That I didn't catch it because I did a find all. So now as I'm going through line by line, I'm still seeing these vestiges of the order.
It's funny because I remember we had that conversation and for me it was it for me as a reader, it jumps out to me when it's said character. And because I did a bunch of research on this too, because I think I had it a couple times myself, and I did some research digging on it, and especially after we had the conversation. The best quick tip I found was read through it and replace the character's name with their pronoun. And, you know, so in like that, in like you wouldn't write said he, said she, you know, and it's like grammatically incorrect. And I was like, okay, I like that as a kind of a hard, fast rule.
Yeah.
And that's what I was like, all right, I'm just going to stick with character said. Plus, it just for me as a reader, like that jumps out and it makes me like, what? That doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, and it's so in the weeds. And I can't say that there's necessarily a hard and fast rule. Like my gut, I want to say something like, whatever you do, be consistent.
That's it. Yeah. I think that's it.
Here's the but is that I've read a lot of like New York Times best-selling authors that use both in the same book, right? So now it's not every other line, but they are not as consistent as you would expect. So it might be one of those things that we are like drilling down into the like, how do you do it? And that there is a little bit of flexibility there, because I have been coming across it more and more that some authors decide to use both. I mean, for me, it's just easier to choose one and go for it, especially if the idea is that you want to create this kind of subconscious rhythm in the reader where they're like, you want them to get into a state of flow, meaning like you want them to like be highway driving. Like they're not thinking that they're reading. They are just reading and picturing effortlessly. And my feeling is that maybe it's the wrong word, like the syncopation, like the beats of not like action beats, but literally like if you're picturing like a drum beat, like the syllables of what they're reading. I think if there is a repetition to it, they're more likely to have those words drip away and they'll be more immersed in the story. Now that's my hope. I have no idea if that's true again, but it feels like something to shoot for. You want to cast a spell and you don't want to draw attention to the language.
Yes. Yeah. It's literally just a marker. Like it should be invisible for the reader, right? It just should be a quick cue to let them know who is talking. And that's why it's like also doing a ton of research. I, get a bunch of articles I'm reading through, and it's like, you also using the, exclaimed, shouted, muttered, whatever. You want to use that very infrequently. Something I came across, because I think that was something I also did quite a bit of. I was like using that as like kind of a crutch to kind of bleeds nicely into action beats, but using it as a way of describing like how they're speaking right now, and not using the dialogue.
So what if it's like dialogue exclamation point, and then would you say Russ said, Russ yelled, or nothing?
The whole thing about using exclamation points, that's a whole nother conversation. I think I have one exclamation point in my entire book.
Oh man, I think I overused them.
I have one in there, and even
that's it for real.
Yep, I have one, and even my editor was like, she was like, this, she's like, this moment and what they're doing and what they're saying right now, this is completely fine if it's fitting to the scene, to the moment. But again, no.
Tim's like, going back. I'm changing it all.
It's also just, I think it's depending on the scene and what's going on. So, I mean, it's.
Can I ask you one question? And it's kind of related. And it's something that I still wrestle with. How often to use, because once again, you're going for clarity.
Yeah.
How often do you use the character name instead of the pronoun?
It depends on if it's new scene. I think I'll use the character name. That's a good question, actually. I use the character name to set the scene to know who's talking, and then I'll move to the pronoun, just so you know like who's in the room and what's going on. So it's like if I have like 3 characters in the room, because like I have a couple scenes where I have multiple characters and they're all talking in the room. So I have to highlight who they are. I think there's one. It's funny you mentioned this. I was just editing a scene where I have 4 characters who are all kind of quickly bouncing back and forth like conversation, and that's, I had to use the character name so you know who's actually saying it.
I feel like sometimes I have like 2 characters who are women, they're talking. I end up using it more frequently.
No, that makes sense.
But also I'll do it, even say it's maybe kind of like a solo scene, or it's one of those kind of interiority scenes. I'll like orient with the character, I'll move to the pronoun, and then sometimes when the pronoun gets too repetitive, I put and that's just a feeling, right? I can't say I have a hard and fast rule. It's just like, I'm like, oh, I said she too much. Let's put the character name. And I have, once again, that I'm going by feeling. I'm not sure if there's a hard and fast rule about that.
I don't think so either. I don't think there is. I think it's, again, just to, if you feel like you need to reset so the reader knows what's going on or who's speaking, throw it in there.
Getting back to dialogue tags, I feel like 9 out of 10 times I'm using said.
Yes.
And I feel like that's probably where you want to be.
Yes.
You don't want everything to be, once again, you want some kind of consistency, and you want that kind of, and it's probably why McCarthy doesn't use them at all.
I have no idea who's speaking in his book. So I think he's a bad example for dialogue tag conversation, because I don't know who's speaking. So I'm like, I don't know who's saying this, but whatever. I think using like the highlighted words, like, I think asked is another one that's okay. Like you can use that.
Sure.
That one's okay to use pretty frequently. But like once you get into like, the shouted, the muttered, the whispered, all yelled or whatever, using them very sparingly. I can think of the number of times I use something other than said. Even in my book, it's probably like 3 or 4 times.
I try to, it's ridiculous. I feel like I'm merging tags with those action beats, maybe a little too much. And I'll say something like breathed, like, not quite whispered, not quite said. They're just kind of like chuffed out the word.
Softly,
and that's probably
softly spoken.
And that's probably something that needs to be a little tidied up in the revision, honestly. Because it should be a little simpler. Yeah,
and I think, and it kind of bleeds nicely into the action beats, because that was something I wasn't doing at all my first 2 drafts. I don't think I didn't, because I didn't understand the tool. I didn't understand that, and like the basic tool of using action beats, and until it's called out, you don't really see it when you're reading, reading a book. Like I don't, I didn't piece it together until afterwards. Like, oh, now I see this. Oh, now I get it. Light bulb. But using the action beat instead of using a dialogue tag, like, it's a good way to mix things up. So if you feel like you're using like he said, they said, whatever, blah, blah, using some action that they're doing can also solve that problem of you needing some, instead of using like, said, you want to say exclaimed, you could be like, Russ slammed his fist into the table, I won't stand for this, and like, okay, that's, you understand, like he's either upset or angry, right? So you don't have to say, he said angrily or whatever.
I mean, the reason why I love the action beats is because I feel like they are, when done correctly or effectively, they're windows into the character.
Yeah.
It allows you to develop a character, whether like they're biting their fingernails or something, or twiddling a pen or whatever.
Yeah.
And then also, if they're not good, they draw attention to themselves. And I think they break the spell. Like, that's why I don't think you always need them, and I think you should probably use them sparingly.
Yeah.
But they are super effective tools when it comes to, one, setting a scene, setting the tone, and then also, I mean, sometimes I'll use them to sneak in character description.
Yeah.
Whether it's like tying back brown hair or something, as opposed to giving a full profile of what the person looks like. I'll try to sneak in a little bit of character description during that beat.
Yeah.
But I love them, and that's why it's.
Too.
But I wonder if I use them too much.
I don't like, I guess it depends, right? Oh, so action beats also they can be a single word, or they can be a sentence, right? So like they could just be like shrugged, gestured, nodded, something like that, right? Like that's an action that the character is doing, some movement or something, right? Or facial expression. It's funny because one of these articles I had pulled up about this, because you're talking about breathed. They have like gasped, breathed, laughed, right? And they call out, they're like, these are actions that are done with the mouth. But many editors will say that you can't breathe or gasp dialogue, which is true.
I feel like, I don't know. I feel like you can breathe dialogue. That kind of frustrated, like.
Like maybe you're having, or it can be like a sentence. So do you find that you will do more like sentence based like action beats, or do you find you use more like he gestured or nodded, or do you do like a mix of them?
I think I do more sentence based ones.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't think that I do the other one at all.
Really?
And maybe I should. Can you give me an example?
Nodded, gestured, something like that. Like some.
Yeah, I do that. I do that a little bit.
I'm probably 50-50 on it. Using the action beats was like a eye-opening moment. Kind of when my editor called it out, and she was like, you can have this be a little more dynamic if you use this tool. And I was like, oh, okay. This makes the scene way more interesting. And now I get it. And it's like, it makes it just cool. It puts life into the scene when you have movement and before. And it's also a great way of not being stuck with being he said, she said, character said constantly. So
I feel like so often when I'm writing and visualizing what the character is going to do, I find myself doing stuff, whether it's like making a fist or like rubbing my eyes or something. And sometimes if it fits, I'll include that, like what I'm doing in that minute. But I will say that as I've gone through this now 5th edit, if anything, I'm taking some out as opposed to adding them, because I do think sometimes I've overused them and my characters are like, it's almost like a stage play where they're like they're moving too much. You know?
Yeah. I would say my third draft, I definitely started pulling them out once I learned that I didn't need to have them there all the time. And then sometimes, like, you can't overdo the action beats. Yeah, a couple here and there. You don't want it to be distracting. And if it's something that's revealing something with the character, that's great. And or just to give a little bit of movement to it. But I could think of one scene in particular where I just had people. I think it was the one where it's like I had 4 or 5 people in a conference room talking. And I was like, this is so boring.
Yeah.
And then I was like, how do I make this interesting? And then I think I overloaded it. And I was like, now everyone's just sipping coffee and putting it down and doing it, walking around the room. Like, I don't know. I'm just kind of like futtering around. Like, well, most people don't do that. Most people are actually just sit at a conference table and have a conversation. But then it was like, all right, well, let me pull this back. I can have one character, he's flipping his pen or something like that, right? Or one character is like tapping the table, or one's leaning back in a chair or something like this, just to give like a little bit of life. But overdoing it can definitely be overwhelming, I think, for the reader, and a little distracting from like the conversation or what's important.
For me, it's like if I overdo it, and when I overdo it, it feels inauthentic.
Yeah.
Once again, it draws attention to the writing,
Yeah.
And like an author choice, a poor author choice that at worst doesn't mesh with the character.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the ones that I've just been cutting. I'm like, it doesn't need it, and not even replacing. Just like, why I put this here. I have no idea why.
Have you noticed that you'll do, because I was just reading this, like how you can combine dialogue tags and actions, if you just have like the single word action. So like something like, I like that piece of chocolate cake or whatever she said with a smile. Do you find you do a lot of that?
Yeah. Or I'll start with like, she smiled and,
dialogue.
Said, dialogue.
And then,
no, I think I do that here and there.
Yeah,
it's interesting. There's so many little tools to use to add like some.
There is.
Yeah.
To identify a character, but also kind of use it as a tool, like you said before. I think it's a great thing to reiterate too, is using it as a way to like provide some insight into the character. Like maybe they've got some tick or something they do.
Yep.
I had one character who was just like, man, he's got nothing. So just like, now he's a big gum guy. He chews gum.
He's a gum guy. It's like Brad Pitt's always eating something in a movie.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like
he loves apples.
All of a sudden, and then it became once I added it, I was like, oh, this kind of this changes the character a bit, and I can use this as a way to like just identify him, right? But also I can use it as a way to like in certain scenes where it's like supposed to be tense. And you got this guy who's just open a piece of gum and pop in his mouth. He just feels like so nonchalant and doesn't give a shit about what you're saying, Yeah. I liked it because I was like, oh, this is good for the character to be so like kind of laid back, but the situation is tense for everyone else. But he's like, I know what I'm doing, Yep.
And
I was like, okay. And I kind of kept it.
That's nice. It's a good character trait.
Yeah. I only did it like once or twice, but it was like in these moments of, tension, just to kind of show he was calm, cool, and collected. But at the same time, someone chewing gum, maybe it's his nervous tick, right? So
it makes me think of I watched some terrible horror movie. I'm spacing on the name, but one of the characters' traits was that she always had a toothbrush in her mouth.
And
I was like, this is so gross. She's just chewing a toothbrush.
Who does that? What is that?
I don't know. I was talking to Jill about it, my wife, and she, I think, had known somebody who did that in real life. And I was like, I guess it's a real trait, but it's such a gross one.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. Just bring a toothbrush around and chew it.
Listeners, if there's one thing you learned from this entire podcast, don't chew a damn toothbrush in public. Keep it in your bathroom where it needs to be.
Maybe it was cool in the 80s,
Back in the 80s, everyone's just chewing their toothbrushes. You can get into like the formatting. I don't know if we want to dive into that because that could be a very complicated conversation of like where you put the commas and blah blah blah. We'll throw some links into like to that, break that down, like how you would format action beats and dialogue tags, because there's a lot of little nuance to it, which was another thing I learned quite a bit. Like where you put the commas and what dialogue is capitalized versus not. I was definitely making a lot of mistakes there. I don't know. I think that's good. What are you reading?
I just started again, or kind of for the first time, The Fifth Obelisk, which you had recommended.
Yes. You texted me the other day and you're like, I figured out why I'm having a hard time reading this because I started with the second book. I'm like, I'll do it.
Yes, I started with the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy and I was like, this is gobbledygook. I don't know how Russ ever read this.
It's like, of all of the trilogies, all the books to like start in the second one, that's not the one to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you're right. It's an interesting mix of second and first person where she starts the book.
Yeah.
But so far I'm digging it. So thanks for the recommendation.
Yeah.
And I gave up on Vampire Lestat, and it felt so good to return that to the library.
Just take this back. I'm done with this.
Once it got to like mother son, I was like 150 pages in, and it became like more uncomfortable than the uncomfortable parts of Interview with the Vampire. There's aspects of those books that I like. I like the setting.
Yeah.
That's about it. I don't like the it's just not my type of vampire story, right? It's borderline romance.
Yeah.
And where I noped out of this one was where Lestat, I haven't even gotten to modern times, which is like the 80s, vampire 80s. I was expecting Lost Boys or something. But Lestat turns his mother into a vampire. And since she's now a vampire, she transcends the familial connection they had, and now they're lovers.
Okay.
And I was like, I don't want to read this anymore.
As Tim chewed his toothbrush. Tim hushed as he chewed his toothbrush.
I mean, I have a hard time not finishing books when I start, so that one was just kind of hanging over me. So maybe I'll come back to it sometime.
Call it a day.
Thinking about reading I feel like cool stuff probably happens. It's just trying to get through, like chewing all that sand to get to the prize at the bottom. I just don't know if it's worth the journey.
If you're feeling like that, just put it down and move on.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
How about you? What are you reading?
Let's see. I just finished The Curse of Chalion. It's Lois McMaster Bujold. She's an author from the 80s. She's written a ton of high fantasy, sci-fi stuff. I got a couple of her books. Friend recommended me. It was fun. It was a good read for high fantasy, which I'm not typically. That's not my genre. Like I dip into it here and there, but I enjoyed it. It got a little slow in the middle, but it's very like high fantasy political type stuff. But I really enjoyed it, and the writing was it was smooth to kind of get into. So I just finished that, and I just started The Black Echo by Michael Connolly. Someone had suggested for because I was looking for like crime, mystery. Yep. I just started. I'm like maybe 100 pages into it, but it's really good. Procedural, very, very detailed in terms of like the crime aspect, which is kind of fun. Like kind of enjoying that and kind of brushing up on those genre, because of potentially the second book I'll be working on will be more in like the crime aspect. So yeah, that's about it for reading. We were just gushing about. We both saw Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Very, very much enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was great. James Gunn did a great job. I'm honestly surprised, just because like the Marvel brand is tarnished, I think, over the past year and a half, 2 years. Like the pandemic wasn't kind to, and they probably weren't kind to their animators or or the board of executives that write the scripts. So it's nice to see James Gunn write a script and have it not be tied to crossovers or toys or whatever Marvel Disney machine is in place, and just have there be a really nice story. It felt with contained, a heart in it.
Yeah, it felt contained to the Guardians of the Galaxy. Like this is it. Like it references obviously the first two movies, but I mean, it stands on its own. It doesn't need to be this sprawling setup for 14 other things.
What else am I watching? Started watching Better Call Saul again.
Okay, never got into it.
It's really good.
Yeah,
as far as like character wise, it's very, very good. It's like a very slow burn. Or maybe it's a no burn, honestly.
Yeah.
But it's nice. It's like a nice character piece.
All right, so that's it. Dialogue tags and action beats, and
that was good.
Yeah, use them sparingly.
What are we doing next time?
I think we're gonna talk about the old AI in writing.
Oh, so can we just
have AI do
ChatGPT do our podcast?
Let's give it a shot. See what happens. See what comes out.
I asked it a question today, and it was totally wrong.
Well, I mean, the internet is mostly wrong.
Also wrong. Yeah, I think there's some use cases for it, and I think there's also, I know of, some disingenuous authors who are pumping out loads of crummy content to make money. So it'd be nice to chat to see where we fall.
Interesting time, considering as of this recording. I mean, the writer's strike is still happening, right?
Yep.
And then you've got this tool that can write. What does that mean?
I mean, it could probably write a Marvel movie.
I mean, you have 15, 20 movies to work off of. Just pump that into an AI, right? And just be like, write me a new one. And be like, all right,
write me Ant-Man 4.
So yeah, that'll be our topic for next time. So check that out. Meantime, you can follow us on Twitter still, right? Writer_syndrome. We are on Instagram, getting more content up there as we go.
Nice.
But yeah, so it's Writer Syndrome Books. You can find all of our old episodes on writersyndrome.com. And if you want to reach out to us, we can do that as well. Send us a question or whatever you want to do. And if you know someone who is a writer and wants to listen to two people talk about it and their failures, send it along to them. Otherwise, keep writing.
Russ breathed.